Thank you, Dan, for coming on and joining me on the podcast today. It's great to finally get to speak, and I've been having a lot of fun on the platform that you've co-founded, or the protocol rather, Farcaster, which you can call a sufficiently decentralized social network. I think it's actually 2 months to the day that I've been on. It's just been a blast, a really great community, and I know still super early for the ambitious mission that you guys are going to build. So I appreciate you taking the time. And I think for those who don't know you, the best place to start would just be to talk about your story and, start as early as you're willing to start and talk about some of the decisions you made along the way.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'm glad you're enjoying Farcaster. If we want to go back to the beginning, I grew up in Massachusetts. I'm the oldest of four boys. I first kind of fell in love with the internet probably around the time we had AOL, so a dial-up connection. And I remember having to ask my parents' permission to be able to go to the computer room to go on the internet because it would block the phone line. And I was limited in the amount of time I got to spend on it. And then in kind of around 2000, I think we got our first broadband connection, and I think that was kind of the unlock for me, in that all you could eat internet, and Google had just come out, and so kind of this access to the world's information. I've always been a big fan of the book A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and the idea of kind of having a computer in your pocket that could access kind of all known information was pretty cool. So obviously when the iPhone came out, that was pretty inspiring. But I think I can remember one thing that I tried to do was I didn't think the internet was fast enough, and so I spent a lot of time on forums on how to potentially hack your cable modem, as well as changing the Windows registry values, which would, on the margin, improve things. I think some of that was placebo, but it was actually my first kind of diving into the internals of a thing that got me inspired to just kind of think about how systems work more broadly, and especially computers. Um, Self-taught programmer in kind of middle school, high school. It's funny, I never kind of took it super seriously. I don't really have any engineers in my family, and so I didn't kind of think that was a career that was, I don't know, as appealing or open to me. And so I thought of it as more of an interest. And so when we went to college, I ended up majoring in English because I thought I was going to go to law school. And fortunately for me, I did an internship between my sophomore and junior year, where I worked at the Attorney General's office in Providence, Rhode Island, in the Narcotics and Organized Crime Unit, which was a fascinating experience, and got to see how the criminal justice system worked up close. But I quickly realized I had no interest in being a lawyer, and that kind of led me to my junior year of college, where I did a little bit of soul searching and ended up kind of doubling down on just what I was interested in, which was technology. And I applied to a remote internship for TechCrunch, the technology news blog, which I think is hard to appreciate for people who are a little younger, how big TechCrunch was at the time. So this is 2009. And effectively, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the tech was kind of this oddity out in Silicon Valley. If you were talking about tech, it was like Microsoft, not these startups. And Michael Arrington had just kind of taken a personal interest of covering companies that he was either considering investing in, had invested in. He was having parties out of his backyard in his house in Atherton. And TechCrunch kind of became this shelling point for technology coverage. I think the YouTube acquisition was announced there. And so it's something I had been reading throughout college. And so I worked on the remote internship. I ended up getting an internship for the summer. So I moved to Palo Alto, and I spent a summer in Silicon Valley, and I was totally enamored and realized that I definitely wanted to be working in Silicon Valley full time. But I didn't necessarily want to be writing about it. I kind of wanted to be in the arena. And so when I went back my senior year, I applied to consulting jobs because a friend had mentioned that, well, if you have an English degree but you work in management consulting, at least people will take you a little more seriously as a business person or an entry level business person. So I ended up working at Bain, and I did 3 years of consulting in Boston, and then moved to Silicon Valley in 2013 without a job. So I thought I was going to start a company. I had this idea for effectively what was like a data analysis tool based on some of the experiences I had working in management consulting, doing big data analysis for companies. And that really didn't get off the ground. So I interviewed at a bunch of places, got rejected from Airbnb and Dropbox, for their like biz ops roles. And then I ended up joining two technical founders working on something called Envoy, which is the visitor sign-in system that you pre-COVID at least was pretty popular with people when they visit offices in Silicon Valley. It's the iPad that sits out in front. And I joined as kind of a first hire that did pretty much everything. So I did customer service, I did analytics, I did the sales, and so all of the kind of roles that were not engineering and design. And I worked at Envoy for almost a year. And in that time, and maybe to just back up, I know this is a little bit of a rambling story, but you wanted the full thing. When
This
I
is
first moved to Silicon Valley,
I was
Fred
just gonna
Urston, one
say
of the co-founders
this
of
is
Coinbase.
this is the perfect version. So sorry to interrupt, but keep going.
Okay, great. So when I first moved to Silicon Valley, Fred Urston, one of the two co-founders of Coinbase, someone I had gone to college with, when I told him I was moving to Silicon Valley, he said, "Hey, we're actually trying to hire at Coinbase. Like we have this huge customer support backlog. We just raised the Series A from Union Square and Ribbit. Do you want to come and work at Coinbase?" And I remember kind of thinking, like, I don't want to work for a Ponzi scheme, like Bitcoin, magic internet money, not my cup of tea. And what was interesting is as soon as I moved to Silicon Valley and actually started meeting, other people building things, engineers, it was like every smart person I ran across had an opinion about Bitcoin or wanted to talk about Bitcoin. This is 2013. And I think the thing that really kind of made me take a second look was Coinbase had raised the Series A in March of 2013. And in December of 2013, they raised a Series B from Andreessen Horowitz. And and we can talk about this later. I've been a big reader of blogs for forever and RSS. And Fred Wilson and Chris Dixon were two people I had always read their blog and big fans of their writing. And so for these two people who I had respected in kind of the Web 2 world, they by investing in Coinbase and doing it in the same year, I kind of took a second look at Bitcoin. And I actually sat down and read the white paper a couple of times. And then it started to click for me. And then it became an obsession that I could not stop thinking about what you could build with Bitcoin and this idea of a new computing primitive for the kind of stack, right? Like, so if you think of TCP IP, and then you add HTTP on top of that, and then you have browsers, and then you add broadband, and then you add kind of mobile, in my mind, and it was a naive opinion at the time, but it got me interested nonetheless, is that I thought people would be using Bitcoin alongside all these other technologies to actually make new apps and experiences. And so I applied and ended up getting a job at Coinbase in spring of 2014. And so that was a shift for me from kind of SaaS to a 20-person company. And my first role was on the business development side of things. And I was trying to sign up merchants to accept Bitcoin as a payment method. And in retrospect, that was like poorly thought out from a first principles standpoint. Bitcoin is slow, it's expensive. You have a taxable gain or loss every time you do a transaction. For merchants, it might make sense in the sense that, you don't have credit card fraud, but from the fact that most consumers don't have it compared to a credit card or a debit card means the merchant actually doesn't care. And so that was kind of this like false promise of an application for Bitcoin in 2014. But I learned some useful things in doing that, and then actually just because I was on the business development team, that later that year I ended up working on the European expansion for the core business, which is buying and selling Bitcoin with fiat. And so in the US we had a bank partner, but in Europe we needed a bank partner that would help us process euros. And so I spent a good chunk of 2014 on the road internationally, meeting with banks all over. And we ended up finding a bank in Estonia that was able to process all of our European payments. And it's kind of like the way to think about it would be like finding a bank in Rhode Island. Yes, it's the smallest state in the country, but a bank in Rhode Island still has access to the ACH system or the Fed wire system. Similarly, Estonia is a super small country. I think it's like 1.3 million people, but full access to the European payment networks. So that ended up being a big break for me. And so from there I became kind of the head of international at Coinbase. And while doing that, we actually ended up having some issues with our US banking partner, which prior to me taking that over, it was just kind of Fred and Brian managing it. So I ended up finding the new banking partners in the US, which put me in a position where kind of I was overseeing the core operational relationship for the company, right? If you think about a company like Coinbase, the businesses take fiat and convert it into, at the time, just Bitcoin. But if that doesn't work, then there is no business. And so it kind of set me up for a promotion that I got later to this kind of VP of operations role, where going into 2017, and Fred was leaving the company to start Paradigm at that point. I was reporting into Brian and I was leading all of the operational functions of the company for the most part. So in addition to the kind of like core payment relationships, biz dev reported to me, biz ops, finance, recruiting, customer support. So there's a bunch of different functions that kind of loosely fall under the thing of the responsibility of the VP of ops. But it ended up being crazy timing because, and for those who don't know, 2017 was an incredible year in terms of just total growth in crypto. It makes the actual 2020, 2021, bull market, which in aggregate dollar numbers is bigger, but just on a relative basis, the amount that crypto grew in 2017 was crazy. And I think, one data point is I think our revenue in 2016 was somewhere on the order of $10 million. And what ended up happening in 2017 is we finished the year with about $1 billion in revenue, of which I think like 350 million happened in the month of December. So it was kind of the most crazy work year for me in my entire career, in that I had a whole bunch of public failures. The customer support problem was really bad. We just couldn't keep up with hiring, so recruiting support reporting into me. So basically every function that was reporting into me kind of broke. And I was learning on the job and doing my best effort. But I think at some point in that year, Brian and I sat down and kind of made the call that we should layer me and hire a COO who had done it before. And I think that ended up being a good decision for a couple of reasons. One, it ended up benefiting the company, and that we ended up hiring real executives. Emily Choi, who's now the COO there, was hired during that period. So that was a good decision. It was a good decision for me because I actually think I built more trust with both Brian and the board, in the sense that I was willing to kind of put the company first rather than maybe my ego and trying to kind of maintain this, oh, well, I'm the VP of ops, I don't want to get layered. And I think in doing so, kind of gave me a lot more freedom within the company in terms of what I wanted to do next, which in kind of after things cooled off in 2018, I took over the consumer business. And so I was the first general manager of what you'd call Coinbase.com and the mobile app. So that was cool in the sense that I got to focus in, instead of focusing on the broad aspect of the business, focus in on it's still the most meaningful portion of revenue, but think a little bit more in product terms and work more closely with the team of, engineers, designers, and product managers on that part of the business. And then I did that for another year and a half and got to a point where I finally knew it was time to leave.
Great. Well, I appreciate you sharing the story, and it's very, very interesting. I've, read a lot of what you've written and listened to you on a couple other podcasts, and haven't heard like 90% of that. So especially the Coinbase chapter, I usually, I sort of get lucky. I don't ask much of a advanced question to start, but somehow asking for people's early story just ends up being a really interesting answer, I think, and not one that you can often hear as a listener and someone who's, been following you on Twitter or something like that. And the early part is always sort of interesting, but even the Coinbase part, obviously very recent. I didn't really know your journey there, and it was really interesting to hear about. I think one thing that is particularly interesting is that you mentioned, you went in and at first sort of the opportunity came up and you didn't really pay much attention, and then got to appreciating Bitcoin and, um, saw that people you had admired for their blogs for a long time were investing, and seemed to be a lot of, progress and quick momentum there. And so, took a second look and ended up joining. But your first responsibility there, like you said, was sort of working on like with merchants on payments, and basically a use case that was anticipated to be a big one from the beginning for Bitcoin that never really panned out, or at least hasn't really panned out yet. And going from that sort of, your primary responsibility sort of being something that was almost dead in the water. Like there's nothing you personally could have done to have made that use case a success, to ultimately running operations to the point where it was just, beyond anything you could even control. I'm curious how you navigated being in that position where like you're new at a company, you're relatively young, and you're tasked with this job that just, no matter what you do, it's not going anywhere. To ultimately sort of diversifying your responsibilities or pivoting them to get responsibilities that gave you the opportunity to prove yourself enough to ultimately sort of be running all of the operations. And then eventually in 2017, when things just got probably too insane for almost anyone to handle, I think it's really interesting that you sort of had that very candid conversation with Brian and everything. But I'm curious, like, how did you navigate your way up within Coinbase over time?
I think it's two things. So the first is, especially people younger in their career, if they're ending up working at a startup, the amount of effort that you can put into the job and get benefit back from is substantially more than I think most people can appreciate. So, uh, opposite example, if you were to work at Google and you're young and you put a ton of effort into your job, the amount that you can actually progress within Google is very much dictated by the corporate hierarchy, which is very driven by tenure.
Hmm.
And if someone hasn't done something egregious, probably isn't getting fired anytime soon. And so the only time you can potentially move up in the organization on average is if someone leaves. And I think that within a startup, you even if the growth isn't happening quite yet, and for a while at Coinbase there wasn't a ton of growth, the the strategic shifts that happen in a small company in search of that growth can offer those types of opportunities. And I think a good example is if you put the effort in on the finding Bitcoin merchants, even if you didn't end up finding a bunch of Bitcoin merchants that turned into a bunch of revenue, how you go about doing that and the level of enthusiasm that you bring to that job, assuming some level of competence, sets you up for the opportunity that comes up to say, hey, we need to go find a bank in Europe. You seem competent enough. You don't really have much experience there, but we don't really have the ability to go hire someone who's a specialist at this point. And so I think that that effort that you put in, even if it's not going to pan out in the existing thing that you're working on, ends up creating the opportunity within the startup that you can actually attach yourself to that ends up working. And I mean, look, you have to get some luck involved in that. And then I think that the navigating kind of how the organization grows, my advice to anyone working at a startup, especially a high growth startup, is the goal is actually to be at a startup with high growth. And by definition, if you really work at a startup with exponential growth, your ability to scale with that business, especially if you're less experienced, is probably not realistic, with maybe the exception of a founder. And I think we're in an era of very founder friendly boards and VCs because of kind of someone like Mark Zuckerberg, where in a traditional era or prior era, people would hire a professional CEO. Look at the Google founders, right? Eric Schmidt. And I think Mark, in staying as the kind of founder and CEO of Facebook, inspired a whole generation of founders to stay in that role, which means even more so that in order to take an inexperienced founder and scale them, you need to actually put experienced executives around that founder. And so I think having that perspective and realizing that, yes, you might be an early employee and have contributed meaningful amounts to the business. If you're not willing to put your ego aside, then what ends up happening is you end up getting kind of either managed out or you're frustrated and you're mad. Whereas you can flip the situation and realize, well, that's just the reality of the situation. And if I actually approach this as, okay, this is ultimately what's best for the company, which by the way benefits your equity, you're going to leave an impression, I think, both on the founder who's just trying to kind of figure all this stuff out, but also the board. Like I think people underrate their visibility at an early stage startup into a board, and having a group of board members who are invested in other companies, or potentially if you want to be an entrepreneur later, could be backing you, right? Chris was on the board of Coinbase, and Andreessen Horowitz and Chris led the round in Merkle manufacturing, my company, for Farcaster. And that's a relationship that if you think in a long-term way rather than kind of like the short term optimization of, okay, my current title or, what's my current job. I think it shifts it to being a much more, okay, this is actually my entry into the big game of startups or big game of tech. And now I'm known as someone who's competent and willing to be a good team player. I think people underrate that. And there's actually a lot of animosity around that in some ways. And I think the right strategy is you should just be thinking in decade long uh, time horizons relative to your career and thinking, okay, if I do what's right by the company and what benefits the equity value, which you obviously should benefit from, that that seems like the optimal strategy from my point of view.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. Just to sort of summarize, I think, work extremely hard, put the team first, and take a long-term view. And all of those things, I think any of them individually might be, not like pretty reasonable to do, but the combination of the three, I think, is pretty difficult. And just naturally, people are selfish, not in like a bad way, but people just sort of, want to improve their situations and short term, everyone's sort of incentivized to think short term. It's difficult to think long term, and working hard is working hard. It's, hard. So combining all of those things is difficult, but it certainly sounds like that's sort of the strategy that you took, and it seemed to certainly pay off. Um, thus far. I think, the first point that you mentioned I thought was interesting and resonated in particular with me about, people generally underestimating how much you can get out in exchange for work put in at a startup basically versus, Google or I think for you might agree, in management consulting at Bain where you started your career. For me, I started in banking, and that was actually a reason I sort of cited with a lot of people was that as for leaving was that I felt like I could do a 7 out of 10 job or a 9 out of 10 job, and it really didn't matter. The deal as like an analyst or whatever, the deal was going to happen at a given price, and my ability to impact that was pretty low, and like it just I didn't feel like the extra effort was really producing anything, and that's not like a situation I want to be in because it just incentivizes like low effort basically, and it's not a habit I wanted to create. And so I think, it's very nice to be in a situation where you do feel that the incremental effort is worthwhile, even if it's not immediately obvious. You can at least sort of have faith that it is. And sort of another parallel between our stories, I think, is that, you left that first job at Bain without knowing what was next exactly. And I did the same thing from banking. And now, years later, when you realized it was time to move on from Coinbase, I think you did the same thing. You didn't know that you were going to go and start Farcaster. You left and sort of took a leap. Can you talk a little bit about like both of those times? I don't know if you sort of connect them in your head, but I think there is something about leaving a situation, whether it's school or, dropping out of school or quitting a job without a next one lined up, that gives you the confidence in retrospect to go and do it again. Can you talk about like either one or both of those instances, having the conviction to leave without knowing what's next? And, I'm sure people were talking to you like, what are you doing, man? Like, why are you quitting? You don't even know what you're doing.
Yeah, they were a little different in that I was leaving a very structured, prestigious job in consulting with a track towards going to something like a Harvard Business School and moving to Silicon Valley to live in a 3 bedroom apartment with roommates I didn't really know. I basically was living in a closet. And I think a lot of people were pretty surprised by that. And I think that the thing I was optimizing for is I wanted to be in startups. And I think part of that was I wanted to be taking risk. And I'm not sure exactly what had contributed to that framework. I think, reading things from Paul Graham or Peter Thiel or Mark Andreessen probably, but I think at the simplest level, evaluating something like, okay, I could have gone and worked in private equity from consulting, and the expected value of a career in private equity probably, X millions of dollars. Whereas with startups, especially if you just kind of view them as, shots on goal or whatever term you want to use, you could go through several startups in 2 or 3 year chunks. And if you end up getting one right over a 10 or 15 year period, you can have a pretty material outcome. And it doesn't even need to be a Coinbase sized outcome, right? And that's actually contributing to the second time I left. In the case of leaving Coinbase, I had a sense that, I think that valuation of the company was about 8 billion at the time. So from an economic outcome, it was going to be fantastic, really, really good. And I think I was thinking in the lines of, okay, I don't really have much more to prove at Coinbase. We'd been there for 5 years, and it started to get into a situation where the ability for me to move up in the org by virtue of us hiring more senior people was pretty limited, right? I could have spent another 3 or 4 more years and maybe got promoted. But I think in terms of thinking about the opportunity cost of my time and working on things that are challenging, I felt like, okay, maybe this is actually the right time to go and actually try to start a company, which I hadn't done before. And so I took some time off leaving Coinbase, and intentionally, I remember telling my wife this. I left on May 1st in 2019. And I told her that I want to be completely off, not think about a single company I want to start until 1 year later. And we did a bunch of travel, but I got sufficiently bored. And I think COVID obviously contributed a little bit to that in the second half of that year. But I think that was the right recipe for me to follow a lot of intellectual interests down rabbit holes that had frankly nothing to do with technology. I read a lot of esoteric history, which is just like an area of interest of mine. And it felt like my brain got a chance to completely detox from just whatever kind of experience I'd had for the previous 5 years. And when I started to approach, okay, like how do I want to think about what I want to work on next? I was starting from really a clean slate, and I did a bunch of time in terms of evaluating everything else that was going on in tech, crypto. And I naturally found myself drawn back to crypto because I felt like it was really the only frontier. Everything else felt like it was like a big company. So like AI is a good example. And Stable Diffusion right now feels the most exciting thing that's happened in AI from my perspective, because it's actually not by like a super well-funded startup, and feels more like a movement. Whereas if you kind of looked at a lot of the stuff that was happening in AI, it was Google or OpenAI or Facebook. And so kind of I hadn't worked in any of those companies. I didn't have networks of people who worked in those companies. And so the ability for me to kind of go and get smart in that area just seemed impractical. Whereas crypto is the closest thing to what it felt like watching Silicon Valley from afar, at least in 2008, 2009, 2010, through the lens of something like TechCrunch, where you kind of had these fringe apps that looked silly, the Instagrams of the world that, you're going to take a photo of your breakfast, that compound over 10 years, they get to be really big. And I think what's exciting about crypto, at least my headspace when I was reconsidering, like, should I do another stint in crypto with what I'm starting, is I think we're finally getting to the point where the infrastructure is actually there, right? So one of the mistakes I made in choosing Coinbase in 2014 is I thought that the infrastructure was basically there and it was time to build apps. And it turns out, no, we probably needed another 5 years at least to get to a place where you can start building the foundational apps in the ecosystem that aren't just strictly money, right? And so I think that was another input, but I don't think I would have been able to figure that out had I not given myself a year of just kind of decompression and some space, frankly, to then come back with a fresh set of eyes and say, oh, I'm actually really excited about working on this idea, and there's a crypto element to it, and kind of tying everything together in a way that if I was, again, at Coinbase and trying to leave to start a company, I actually don't think I would have been thinking as big. And that's another thing I think that space can provide you is the ability to kind of, I don't know, maybe think bigger. I don't think of myself as anywhere close to an Elon in terms of the just like drive, frankly. Like, I think he's willing to sacrifice a lot more than I am. But in terms of looking at how he approached SpaceX, and this is just, through his biography, and looking at kind of this multi-decade long journey, and he knew that was the case up front, and being willing to work on that, as well as something like Tesla, I think is inspirational in that if you do have a little bit of economic security, and in my case, the Coinbase outcome, again, I was thinking that it was going to be smaller than it was and ended up being bigger, with great, but it didn't change the idea that I felt like I could actually take a longer term point of view on what I wanted to work on, versus if Coinbase hadn't worked out, I probably would have ended up working on, I don't know, something that was maybe a higher likelihood of a couple $100 million exit if I was trying to like kind of optimize for like a very specific concrete business problem rather than what I am working on, which is let's build a protocol for building social networks. And how do you bootstrap a social network when you don't actually have a fundamentally new social primitive?
Yeah, I'm a huge advocate, having done it a couple of times myself, for just giving yourself some time and space to remove yourself from whatever it is that you're doing, whether it's, banking or consulting or working at Coinbase or whatever it might be. And I think it's certainly not the typical path. Most people like to sort of have the next lily pad lined up before they jump off the current one. But there's something that's maybe a little bit hard to describe, but I think you did a good job of describing, to, taking that time. And I feel like you do have to sort of set a minimum. You said, a year. I don't want to start anything or join any company or start any company or basically commit myself to anything besides traveling and reading and just sort of relaxing and decompressing a little bit. And it's sort of hard to do for people who are, want to wake up and get to work on things. But there's a lot of value to it, I think. So, you mentioned obviously Farcaster was the thing that took you out of that time and was the area where you wanted to commit the next 10 to 15 plus years of your life, which I think is sort of how you have to approach any hugely ambitious startup. I mean, you look at Brian with Coinbase or Elon, you mentioned, these things don't just become successful overnight, especially if you're the founder. You sort of have to see it all through if you want it to have any chance of success. What was it about, social media, social networking that in particular drew your attention? And can you sort of describe Farcaster briefly, for those who haven't yet, gone on the app or seen anything about it?
Consuming information is the original hook for me on the internet. I think I mentioned that before. And I've been a user of RSS and RSS feed readers for, I don't know, as long as I can remember. And Twitter came out, 2006, 2007. I had signed up in college. I built an early Twitter API app, and I've been a power user on Twitter for 15 plus years. It was kind of a joke at Coinbase that if something happened on Twitter, I would know about it. And so it's just natural areas of interest for me. I like to think of myself as someone who deeply understands the Twitter product, despite never having worked there, or frankly at any other social media company. Just a user of the products, not an employee. And I think that space has always been interesting to me and has been rattling around my brain in terms of how would you actually make Twitter a protocol, and that ultimately was the question that when I reconnected with Varun, who my co-founder I worked with at Coinbase, he and I both kind of thought that the question of how do you make RSS competitive with Twitter was an intellectually interesting one. And we evaluated a bunch of other ideas that were not related to this, but we ended up coming back to this idea and started to build a prototype to kind of say, okay, well, RSS is this kind of boring old protocol, doesn't have much state. I don't know, for those on the line, it's just kind of this idea that anyone can kind of publish an RSS feed from their blog or website, and they can change it any way they want. And there's kind of no way to authenticate, okay, well, this was like this before, or if I like a blog post, how do you even represent that? Where something like Twitter, all that's solved because it's all just Twitter database. And I think we kind of went through from a first principles standpoint, what are the things that kind of led to RSS's demise, right? Because there was a period where RSS and Twitter, when Twitter was much smaller, were roughly comparable. And there were actually a lot of RSS power users. Google had a product called Google Reader, which was free. And then over the first 5 years of Twitter's kind of existence, basically killed RSS. It was a superior product, especially on mobile. And Google ended up killing Google Reader, which kind of nuked the RSS space for a while. The interesting thing is that RSS is actually how all podcasts are distributed. So person listening to this podcast right now, whatever client you use, whether that's Spotify or Apple Podcasts, in the background, RSS is the way that the podcast audio file gets distributed to all the different services that ultimately you listen to. So it's actually still used, and probably if you just look at the growth of podcasts, it's probably used more than it ever has been. But there is no company, there is no core team. Frankly, it was a one-person effort, And so it kind of hasn't really, it's stagnated. And so it's in some ways like email in that it's really not progressed in terms of the technology. And so I think where we approached Farcaster, and ultimately the RSS Plus was the name of what we called, what turned into Farcaster, is we are going to build a company that actually builds the initial client on top of the protocol. And our belief is that if you want to build a protocol, something as big as email, which is SMTP, or the web, which is HTTP, you actually need to build that first great user experience. And I think two analogs here: HTML, HTTP, Tim Berners-Lee. That was this academic protocol that was invented. But the thing that actually made the web start to take off exponentially was the launch of Netscape, which Marc Andreessen was one of the co-founders, and it was taking in an academic project, Mosaic, the browser, and turning it into a commercial product, Netscape, which moved at a much faster rate of innovation and really pulled the web forward in terms of a timeline. And so a good example of this is Netscape wanted to enable the ability for people to have e-commerce experiences. So they invented SSL, which is the way you do kind of secure shopping online. And when you kind of have a commercial imperative, you can actually still build these open standards and open protocols, but because you're actually trying to make a superior user experience for your users' customers, I think that is the optimal way to actually build out protocols in terms of you dog food your own protocol, but then you're improving your client, your app as fast as possible. And then the other example I would use is the iPhone, which the original iPhone was only first-party apps. So Apple built every single initial app on the original iPhone, including a YouTube app and a Google Maps app. So they got the data from Google, but Apple was the one that built the app. And the thinking there was you get an installed base, and I think in the first year they sold somewhere between 5 and 10 million iPhones. And then a year later, you can launch the App Store because you've done the hard work of getting that initial set of 5 to 10 million people to actually be a daily active user of the phone. A phone is literally carried around on your physical person. So it's an amazing developer platform when they open it up a year later, because now it's, hey, we've built this operating system device that we can handle all these different devices and sizes and all this other kind of stuff. And you as a developer can just ship once and it can go out to all these other potential users. And so I think that those two things have inspired us in terms of how we've approached building what we're building. And I guess I should define what Farcaster is. I think you mentioned at the beginning, but Farcaster is a sufficiently decentralized social network, and it has two properties that are different than centralized social networks. The first is, as a user, you have a direct relationship with your audience. And the way to think about that is, if you make a living by, I don't know, publishing tweets or YouTube videos, or pick your favorite type of media, if for whatever reason an app in Farcaster doesn't want to allow you to use it as a platform, you as the user have the right to actually switch to a different app, but maintain access to your audience. And if you think about something like YouTube or Twitter, if you've built up an audience on either of those social networks, and either of those social networks chooses to not have you be able to use it anymore, there's no way to export those followers, right? And so one of the reasons people always want to try to get an email address from subscribers is that it's a fallback to be able to contact them. The second thing that Farcaster enables is, because it's a protocol, all of the data and APIs are open, which enables a developer to say, if you want to build an application on top of the Farcaster protocol, you have a direct relationship with not only the underlying core data and APIs, but any user that chooses to use your app, that's a direct relationship between you as a developer and the user. Contrast that to Twitter, which Twitter in the early days, actually, a lot of Twitter's early usage came through third-party Twitter clients. And there was a while where Twitter didn't even have a native mobile app. All of the early Twitter mobile apps were kind of built by independent developers. And at a certain point, Twitter said, hey, we are actually going to force most users to go use the core Twitter app, which can display ads better for us and all these other potential reasons. And overnight, a whole bunch of businesses were kind of had the rug pulled out from under them. Another example of this is Facebook. Facebook built a big app developer platform right before they made the huge pivot to mobile. And Zynga built a really meaningful business on top of Facebook. Facebook changed the rules. That has serious impact on Zynga. And I think the guarantee with Farcaster is because you're actually moving those core APIs and the data to a protocol, it ultimately becomes a user's decision whether or not they want to use an app. And I think that that's a really strong and powerful guarantee that you can offer a developer for when they're thinking about, okay, should I actually invest time to go build a really high quality app and experience? And if they know that someone else could at some point just turn the APIs off, then they're, I think, on the margin less likely to do that. Whereas in the case of kind of protocol based app development, you can make that investment knowing that no one is going to be able to kick you off the protocol. And ultimately, it's on you to develop the relationship with users.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly more attractive to go and either build a client or even just as a user interact with a platform with certainty that what you do there will, persist in the long haul, independent of one organization or one person making a decision. Trump being like an obvious example on Twitter, invested a ton of time there and arguably probably contributed materially to helping him win the presidency and ultimately got kicked and from that and other platforms and tried to build his own and whatnot. That's a little bit of a separate story, but that was one of the biggest moments for me that I realized why it's important that um, social media and social networks are decentralized because that's a lot of power that Jack had or Twitter as an organization had and it's just very debatable. Like there's still obviously people who would have preferred to continue to see Trump's tweets and, maybe they don't go sign up for his new platform or whatever. I think there's a lot of hype around decentralization these days, and especially in the crypto world. And people forget that, what the actual point is. And I think when it comes to social media, a large part of the point is, decentralization isn't an end in and of itself, but rather a means to censorship resistance just as it is in, the example of Bitcoin, for example, when it comes to money, you're sort of becoming independent from the Fed printing tons of money and, doing what they want in monetary policy and things like that. In this case, it's, making sure that no one's in control of what you're allowed to post or what platforms you're allowed to be on and things like this, and having the option to exit and participate in whatever platforms you want, basically, and have your audience, have that direct relationship that you mentioned. So sufficient decentralization, I think, is a very interesting way to sort of attack that issue because what it's clearly not is maximal decentralization. You're with Farcaster, you're not attempting to have every individual post on the blockchain, which can create scaling issues and things like this. And I think if I can draw an analogy with Coinbase, and you can maybe tell me how on or off this might be, but Coinbase, in the early days made a very contrarian decision in a space that was crypto or really just Bitcoin at the time that was very much, pro decentralization and anti-regulation to create a centralized exchange, opposing decentralization in some sense, and, appreciating decentralization, but being a centralized exchange was just a naturally sort of opposite move. And then embracing regulators and trying to educate regulators in, again, a space that was generally anti-regulation. Farcaster, I think is taking a space that, again, is largely decentralized and saying, well, we don't need to be maximally decentralized. We'll sort of decentralize the registry, and you can create your profile or your handle in a way that is decentralized, but we'll go and actually, we'll start by hosting the messages ourselves, similar to like Coinbase hosting your funds. But the difference is, unlike Twitter, you can take these anytime and exit. Just like on Coinbase, you can take your funds and go to self-custody. On Farcaster, I imagine sort of in the future, you can take your, if not already, you can take your, go from being hosted on Farcaster to hosting yourself. Is that a reasonable analogy? And how did you ultimately come to that decision of like, what do we actually need to decentralize here and what is okay to keep centralized?
couple things. The first is an excellent book by Tim Wu called The Master Switch, which talks about the history of communications technologies. And the core point of the book is that most new communications technologies start out decentralized, hobbyists, tinkerers, small businesses, and naturally centralize. And the core reason is the centralized bigger companies in whether it's phone or television or in case social media recently, is they offer superior user experience, and there's economies of scale, and so you get all these benefits that start to compound. And I think that that is an important framework to realize. That basically an indication that consumer preference is for superior user experience. And I think that if you start with the belief that actually people want decentralization, that is you're not rooted in the correct average consumer psychology. Like the, consumers care about user experience. And Clayton Christensen's jobs to be done framework, I think, is pretty good on that. And it's like if something has a superior user experience and is satisfying whatever the consumer's job to be done, they're probably going to use that. And so I think that that is important to think about. And then the second one is something that I lived at Coinbase is you could see that even though Bitcoin and cryptocurrency broadly is a decentralizing force, the revealed preference of consumers is to, yes, I want to get involved. I want to buy some Bitcoin or ETH, but I don't really want to figure everything else out. So I'm willing to sign up with Coinbase, which offers a pretty good user experience for someone onboarding into crypto. And that's about it. They never withdraw their Bitcoin or ETH. They don't go use a user-controlled wallet. All of that stuff is, I still think, very much in the realm of power users, early adopters, people who genuinely find experimenting with stuff fun. And so by taking kind of those two things, I think where you should start, if you're trying to increase decentralization for a given system, is start with the current paradigm, which I'm assuming is going to be centralized. And then if you think of the spectrum of centralization to decentralization, work your way from the centralized point down that line to the point where you hit what we would call sufficient decentralization. And in my mind, it's you keep all of the benefits of centralization while adding an important characteristic of decentralization, which I would describe as exit with interoperability. And the way to think about that is, let's say you have a company, acmeco.com, and you sign up for a G Suite Google provided email service for your domain. And you really decide you don't want to work with Google anymore and you want to switch over to a Microsoft hosted email service. That operation is call it 30-minute process. And once you've switched the kind of pointer for the domain from Google to Microsoft, you have no interruption in your business. People who had your email address before can continue to send you email. And that forces Google and Microsoft, as well as all of the other email providers, to actually have to be responsive to customer needs and compete. And so that's this kind of idea that you can exit an existing provider and then interoperate with all of everything you were doing before. Another good example of this is in cell phone carriers. Prior to, and I think this was a law, and I'm generally skeptical of most regulation, but in this case, this was good regulation in that the ability to switch phone number between cell providers actually makes that market a bit more competitive, because now I can actually take a phone number which already people have in their contact book, and I can switch it over from AT&T to Verizon or Verizon to Google Fi, and on the margin, I think that makes the market more competitive versus having you locked in. And I think that in the case of cell phone providers, it's because the spectrum is actually limited, and so you can't just go create a new cell phone provider. But I think that this concept of exit with interoperability is the thing that you want to, in any system, try to get to actually hit a minimum level of decentralization that I think is sufficient. Because effectively what you're doing with exit with interoperability is you've created competition. In the case of Farcaster, and this works today, by the way, there's really only one client. It's the client that we've built because we've been spending the last 2 years working on this. So it's pretty polished. But Farcaster as a protocol will only be healthy when there is a sufficiently feature parity or competitive client that if anyone gets pissed at the way Dan and Varun are running our client, they can just simply switch to the other client. And that actually will force us as a company to be more responsive to customer user needs. And I think that is something that we think a lot about from the protocol standpoint. So I wouldn't be surprised that in the next year, if we put some substantial amount of work, whether it's through open sourcing a bunch of stuff or actually potentially even funding another team to build a competitive client. Because until that hits that point, we don't really have a protocol. We have, yes, the foundations of a protocol and the ability to kind of say, hey, the APIs and data are open. But if for whatever reason we have to kick a user off of our client for some terms of service violation, where are they practically going to go? And if they can't go anywhere else, then you actually haven't hit that level of a protocol. Compare that to the web, right? So if not that this happens, but if Google Chrome really didn't want to work with you, you could use Safari, you could use Firefox, you could use, pick your favorite browser. And so that I think is really, really important to hit if you're trying to build a protocol. And this is beyond just Farcaster, but anyone building a protocol needs to hit that level before they can really start calling it a protocol.
So just to take this example a couple steps further, and actually, first of all, do you have a couple more minutes? Or do you have
Yeah.
a
I
hard
can I
stop?
can go till whatever time.
All right, cool. Great. Well, I mean, this is really interesting. I've been really enjoying Farcaster, like I said, so it's great to be able to ask a few questions, and I'm sure people listening are interested as well. So just to walk a bit further with that example, we don't need to use Trump per se. People are unnecessarily divided on that, but user XYZ is on Farcaster today, and for whatever reason, does something totally just against all of your values and principles, and you decide, he's not welcome on the Farcaster client anymore. This is like 2, 3 years from now, something like that. But he's okay on the protocol because everyone's okay on the protocol, basically. So how does that guy or girl continue to reach his audience, assuming that there's some competitive clients out there? Are these people, if he has a following on Farcaster, the client, are those people now forced to go somewhere else to view his content? Or how does that actually look like logistically?
Each client is going to have to make that decision for themselves. But given that we're building the initial client, I think we will have a lot of influence in terms of what the default pattern for this will be. But I like to use the web as a good analogy for this. So when you get kicked off, our Farcaster client, Merkle Manufacturers is our company name. We need to name that client something not Farcaster at some point, so it's very clear that there's a separate protocol versus client, right? Gmail and email are very clear that one is different than the other. But if you get kicked off our client and you are continuing to use the protocol, that to me should just be no different than the way a web browser handles the difference between being indexed by Google and a URL, right? So let's say you have some reprehensible content. I don't even know. Google decides not to index your web page. Everyone understands that Google has every right to decide what pages it indexes, right? That's like their prerogative. They're competing search engines. Yes, Google's the biggest, but no one is confused that if Google doesn't have your web page indexed in its search engine, that you, as the website operator, go direct to your audience and say, hey, well, go to my.com. Like that's how you get to that web page. And I think that similarly should happen with Farcaster clients, where you can imagine that the distribution you get from a recast or the whatever algorithm a client has, that might go to zero because that's essentially proprietary to that client, right? That's not at a protocol level. But you can imagine that if you're following someone who's been kicked off that client, instead of showing it in feed, you could say, hey, there was a post from this user. We don't index that content in the same way that Google doesn't index a web page, but it might let you know that if you tap a button, it'll kick you out to the browser and it'll open up that piece of content, right? And so that becomes a pretty reasonable trade-off in that you haven't censored an individual, but you are not giving them a premium user experience and the virality of like a social feed. And I think that the counter to the client there in terms of a market force is if you get too aggressive in doing this kind of like, oh, you're not allowed to be on the client, you're not allowed to be on the client, you're going to have some subset of users who are saying, hey, I I'm an adult, I want to be able to look at what I want to look at, and I'm going to go use a different client, whether it's a competing company or an open source client, and that's the way the web works, right? So we're not at a place yet where Google takes Chrome and it says, "Oh, this web page isn't allowed to be viewed in Chrome." The only time they do that is if you don't have your security certificate properly set up. So maybe it changes web browsers, but I think web browsers are a much healthier ecosystem. And the reason I don't think people complain about web browsers not censoring web pages is because distribution and hosting are separated, right? And I think that the challenge with centralized social media is if I put a tweet up, that tweet is fundamentally linked to an identity that's owned by Twitter, to a hosted set of media and files or text that Twitter is hosting, as well as Twitter's virality of its feed and its content moderation policy. So in a protocol-based system, you can actually separate different parts of the stack there, and hosting can be in one place, distribution is in another, content moderation is in another, and ultimately the identity doesn't belong to anyone, and it actually lives in this kind of low-level core smart contract. And for us, that's actually a reasonable use of a blockchain, right? Because you can actually write software that can run forever, that doesn't need to be paid for on an AWS bill, right? Once you've deployed a smart contract, you can effectively have the users, by virtue of them registering a username, pay for the ongoing use of that contract. And so that's actually, to me, a really powerful example of where a blockchain is superior to a kind of centralized experience, because you've taken that core primitive out of any one company or individual's control, and you've kind of put it in this neutral, very simple protocol that has no opinion about what content gets posted. It's just a mapping of a username to a private key or a public key.
Yeah, no, that definitely helps sort of paint the picture for me. And of course, it's always difficult, if not impossible, to sort of predict how these things are going to play out. But I think your vision for all of it is obviously, founded in a lot of knowledge about the history of all of these various protocols and platforms, and deep understanding from, a decade and a half of experience on Twitter and consuming RSS and generally information on the internet. So it's going to be very interesting. And I know a big part of your guys' pitch as well is, maybe not pitch, but just the way you're thinking about things is like, it's not totally up to you to invent this future. You're just sort of building the protocol and the initial platform that can, get sort of critical mass of people involved, and then open it up to the devs, decentralized developers, basically, to go and build whatever they want on it and sort of invent the future, collaboratively and in a decentralized manner. And I'm just, decentralized, maybe overused term a little bit, but just in a way that it's not all the people from one team who are building this ecosystem. It's a bunch of different people with a bunch of different ideas, and whoever creates the best products ultimately should win. So I think it's really interesting. But you guys, as you mentioned, felt it's very important to start with building the first platform and building the first client. And right now, protocol is called Farcaster. The platform is also called Farcaster. And I've been on for a couple of months, like I mentioned at the top of the show, and have just found it to be a very refreshing place to, go read stuff on the internet or whatever, and communicate with people. Comparably to Twitter, I was much later on Twitter than you were, but you've sort of seen the evolution over a decade and a half, or the devolution more recently, you could argue. But I think Farcaster is somehow, there's no bots, there's no spam. The people have been sort of hand curated by you to a few thousand or however many there are today. Can you talk about how you've, first of all, why is it important to curate so carefully that initial community? And I'm sort of surprised by like how high quality it is, given that my understanding is like it's basically just DM you and like you're good. for the most part, unless it's like obviously like a spam bot or something like that. But I'm curious to hear how you've gone about like strategically curating this initial community and why that's been so important.
We changed our approach a little bit over the last year. We've been running the beta for about a year now. And the initial approach was I reached out to a bunch of people in my network, right? I've worked in crypto for almost 8 years now. And the kind of time I spent in Silicon Valley. So I onboarded the first 400 people to Farcaster with a Zoom call. So kind of superhuman style, 15 minutes, explain what we were doing, kind of how the architecture worked, and then went through an onboarding where we did a screen share, and it was a desktop client to start. So it was kind of easy to do that. And what was interesting is we had a bunch of churn. These people all knew me, good friends, in some cases, but I think a lot of them had existing Twitter audiences, and the conversational liquidity was just too low. It was mostly me posting, and I think what ended up starting to work a little bit better was there were a few people of those 400 that stuck around, and it was resonating for whatever reason, and they became pretty passionate about saying, "Hey, you should check out Farcaster. This seems pretty cool." And the next wave of, call it another 500-ish or so, were mostly referrals. And I think they retained at a better rate than the initial because they tended to be people who were friends with the people who this resonated with. And on average, I think most of these people don't have existing big Twitter audiences. So their opportunity cost to switch was lower. And that's an interesting point because there's an essay from a friend, Eugene Wei, called Status as a Service that I highly recommend everyone read that talks about this. But basically, new social networks appeal to people who aren't already in the, call it, nobility of whatever social network before it. And there's this proof of work in the early days in terms of you kind of earning your chops to build the audience that ultimately, compounds it as the network starts to grow. And so that very much played out with Farcaster. But I do think that the other strategy that we shifted over to probably in the last 4 months, 5 months, is this DM me on Twitter. And we've added a lot of friction to the sign up flow. So what we get out of that is we get really high intent users. And I get plenty of spam Twitter accounts that send me, I would like an invite to Farcaster. But what's interesting is, I follow, I don't know how many people at this point, 1,000 people on Twitter, and a lot of people in the crypto world, a lot of people I don't even know. I just, see an account, they get retweeted, they seem to be into crypto, I click yes. And so I get an interesting sample that if you DM me, I can actually see, do we have any mutuals in the sense of people I'm following who follow you? And then similarly, just the ability to just go back and forth over to direct messages creates a friction for, it's just very hard for a bot. I don't know. I don't think I'm failing the Turing test quite yet, but I think you have to be a little bit more intentional. And what's interesting is I basically let anyone in that I kind of pass as a, like, okay, you seem like a reasonable human. I can see your public tweets, right? And usually probably don't let an account that's like 1 month old on Twitter onto Farcaster. And so I think it's worked really well in terms of this kind of curated community. But at some point in the last, 4 to 6 months, the conversational liquidity flipped, and it got to a point where it wasn't just me posting a lot. I still post quite a bit, but it got to the point where you could refresh the feed if you're following enough people, and you'd get new content. And now we're to the point where I still follow everyone on the network for the most part. So there's, a little over 3,000 people, and I can't keep up with the feed. Like, so it's actually being used during kind of, daytime hours at a rate that is faster than my Twitter feed refreshes, which is kind of wild. So I think we have hit a conversational liquidity point, which is exciting because that actually is a good launching point for people who want to build apps. There's actually enough data, like real data, in terms of people posting and all the stuff that's associated with that. And I think that the other thing about conversational liquidity, similar to financial liquidity, which I learned a lot about at Coinbase, is liquidity begets liquidity. So now people are actually pinging me on Twitter DM and saying, hey, someone showed me Farcaster at a conference on their phone, and it looked really cool. Can I check it out now? And so the idea that you can actually get to a point where the app can actually be its own advertisement through these referrals beyond just someone who's really passionate about it, that's been working. And then more recently, it's actually, we've had a lot of these organic tweets where someone who had reached out to me via DM onboards to Farcaster, really enjoys their initial experience, then tweets. And then all I've been doing is just retweeting that, or maybe I sometimes quote tweet it with a comment. And it inevitably brings in more people because they're seeing it's not just me talking about how, great Farcaster is. It's actually some other person that, if you see 3 or 4 of those endorsements, you're like, okay, might as well check it out. And so far it's been working pretty well. I do think we're going to have a challenge beyond maybe call it 10,000. So, we could probably keep doing this strategy for the next few months, but I think beyond 10,000 users signed up, I think we're going to have to think through new growth strategies. And I always think in orders of magnitude, and I think this peters out at some point. And I think going from 10,000 to 100,000 while trying to maintain some semblance of quality I don't have an answer for you, but it's something that we're starting to think about.
Yeah, is there any like milestone that you have in mind in terms of like you mentioned, you have friends who have huge followings on Twitter and you get them and they're excited about Farcaster. It's, sufficiently decentralized social network that they're all about that, like philosophically and everything like that. But, like you mentioned earlier, people just sort of they can sort of say what they want or, have these beliefs that they want, but at the end of the day, they sort of just want the experience. And if you have a million people following you on Twitter and, 110 on Farcaster, it's sort of hard to convince yourself to like spend time there as someone who's already really, really established on Twitter. And of course, you can build a huge social network without those people. By definition, the vast majority of people on social media or Twitter specifically, don't have a million, let alone 100,000, let alone 10,000 or even 1,000 followers. But at the end of the day, in the long run, you probably want some of these people to come over. So, maybe for example, one milestone could be like get someone with XYZ number of followers, 100,000, a million to go like full-time Farcaster where they're not even tweeting anymore at all. Like maybe they spend some time doing both, which like that's currently where I am, right? Like I'm not willing to stop tweeting to just use Farcaster exclusively right now, but I'm more than happy to post across both. And it feels like a great use of my time because there's an awesome group of people that I've mentioned on Farcaster. And I actually, with like, for my own example, I probably have what, 1/10 or even a bit less of the number of followers on Farcaster as I do on Twitter. And yet I find that like for the average post, it's actually better quantity and quality of engagement. So quantity in terms of like, faves and things like this, and then quality in terms of like genuine comments. You can ask a question on Farcaster and you get like real answers versus Twitter. It's like sort of posting into a void a lot of times, or if you do have sufficient following, it's not a void, but it's like a spam, a universe of spam or whatever. Everyone's just scam posting and things like this. So anyway, I guess that's a long-winded way of asking, like, are there any particular goals that you have in mind, or just keep executing the processes that you've been running and continue to figure things out as you go?
I think I got a little bit more hung up on this last year, and I spent a lot of cycles thinking through. I'm friends with biology and folks like that, and it's like, okay, you're ideologically aligned with something like this, and like, how do I get you to switch full time? But the more I actually think about it from first principles, that threshold is going to be pretty far because of that reach that you have on Twitter. Whatever you're trying to do, that's like potentially very valuable, right? The most extreme example of this is obviously Elon, right? Like Elon's Twitter account is probably, I don't even think Tesla does marketing, right? It's like all of his companies benefit from the fact that he has this massive amount of distribution. So I think I underrated the value of distribution for people on something like Twitter for just like pure professional or gaining additional status. That said, it's something you brought up. And I think we will be in a position to quantify this a little bit better over the next 6 months. But it's the engagement that you can get for the exact same post between Farcaster and Twitter that I think will start to win people over. And if we can continue to focus on quality of signups, so yeah, aggregate total number of followers is going to be smaller. But there was a post today, for example, my friend Jackson, he posted something on Twitter. It was a screenshot essay about just like the frontier of tech and crypto. And I think he got something in the order of 30 something likes, and it might be higher now, and no replies. And on Farcaster, he posted, and within 20 minutes, he had 4 replies. And there was actually a pretty substantial discussion that happened where, it continued to go down the tree in a different direction. And so it was just generating a lot of engagement from people having like very thoughtful answers and ways of engaging. And I think that in of itself is like, if you're strictly for I want to be able to say I tweeted something out to 100,000 plus people, sure. But if you actually are using the social network for having a real conversation or improving your ideas, I think Farcaster with a very small user base is going to be able to meet or exceed that on average for most people within the next year. And I think that is something to just continue to focus on. And a lot of people actually mentioned that Farcaster feels like early Quora. And the reason I think they say that is that early Quora had very thoughtful replies from a variety of people. And so I think no guarantees that we can continue to maintain that. But I think deeply I'm thinking deeply about product decisions that we can make that can enhance that and even increase the amount of engagement people get. Because I actually view likes as like a pretty basic indication that like, okay, I read this, like I liked it. It's kind of almost like a read receipt. Whereas I think a reply, especially a thoughtful one, that's a lot more effort. And so quantifying the level of engagement per cast relative to the amount of followers people have, I think is an area that we're probably going to double down on.
Yeah, I feel like part of it, to your point on like likes being somewhat like read receipts, I feel like that's just the default response. Like, I mean, the default response, I guess, is to not interact with the tweet that you see at all. And then default two is to like it if there's sort of any reaction to it positively, basically. And the comment, like almost, I think for a lot of people, isn't even a consideration. Whereas on Farcaster, there's a lot of casts that are, posed as questions or soliciting feedback. And it feels like, in a way, commenting is just as equal of a default almost as liking and or faving or whatever. And I don't know. It's like I don't know how all of this is going to scale. And to your point, it's going to be definitely a challenge to get, from 10,000 to 100,000, a very different breed of challenge than it was to get to the first 1,000 and then 1,000 to 10. But um, it'll be interesting to see how all of this sort of adapts with scale. But certainly for people listening now, I think it's a worthwhile experiment to go get involved with, especially if you don't have a huge following on Twitter. You got nothing to lose, like we've been talking about. So, DM Dan and check it out. As long as you're not a bot. But if you're listening, you're probably not a bot. Um, all right, so I want to transition a little bit in closing with a couple of questions on not like personal necessarily, very much related to all this that we're talking about, but not like as exclusively focused on Farcaster. And the first is, well, I mean, this one is sort of focused on Farcaster to some extent, but I'm curious, like just as a founder building a social media platform and a protocol, it's part of your job. Like you said, in the early days, you basically were the feed. And that's less and less the case as you're getting this conversational liquidity. But being on the platform and interacting on social media, Farcaster in particular, but also Twitter and being in your DMs and things, this is all like very much a part of your job. It's like something that is very beneficial to what you're building, and it's something you have to do and might enjoy doing. But social media is inherently a huge distraction, in addition to all of the great value that it has. It's just a distraction for a lot of people as well, and sort of the you know double-sided sword or whatever you call it. So how do you manage, like, are there any rules you put in place for yourself on like, okay, I'm gonna go and binge for this number of hours at this time and then shut it down for the day? I'm curious just how you manage that thing that for a lot of people, like, there's no, there's value to being on social networks, but there's not as direct value as building the company. So I'm curious how you balance that as you're building.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a struggle in that sometimes when I'm using Farcaster, I'm wondering, okay, is this actually the best use of my time? But the reality is using your own product and being as much of a power user as anyone on the platform gives you a deeper understanding about the product for that when you do some of that product thinking or shifting over towards like what should we be building and how. you have a very deep intuitive sense on what works and what doesn't. I think that the other thing to consider is, so there are different phases of building product for a social network, but I suspect that we have shifted for Farcaster is very much right now is actually building the community. And I don't love that word because it's like got a lot of meanings for different people, but or the network maybe is a better term for it.
Yeah.
Is so when I'm putting effort into fostering the network or answering people's questions, it creates an interaction that says, okay, this is actually much more human than maybe the kind of void that is the centralized social media of something like a Twitter. So that in of itself is actually building the company in some ways. And I think it's hard to say, oh, well, just hire an intern and have them answer people's questions. And I don't think it has the same effect. So in some ways, it goes back to a Paul Graham essay: do things that don't scale. I don't think you can do it forever at the rate that I'm doing it, just because I think the network will scale, and it's just like, okay, then I'll just have to be selective. But I don't think that ever goes away, because the moment I stop really engaging at a deep level in the network, I'm going to actually lose the pulse of kind of like how things are going. Like you can only look at so many metrics dashboards and things like that. I think that the other thing with the kind of like distracting component of social media, and this is one of the reasons I love RSS, is so in RSS, you have RSS readers, right? And there's a variety of clients that tend to be indie in the sense that they're not venture backed. And so a lot of them are either you pay for the software or you subscribe to the software. I use one called Feedbin. And I actually have different clients on my iPhone and on my Mac. And so I spend a decent amount of money on software related to RSS. But what's cool about it is you get a lot of configurability, because the developer to customer relationship is not one of time spent, which ultimately translates into ads. It's one of trying to give you as much utility. And I think that that is an underrated thing that we really haven't explored yet, given that the dominant mode of social networks that won over the last 10 years were all advertising driven. But if you just use television as an example, think about how wild it is to go and watch network television now, where for any given TV show, you would, of a 30-minute slot, spend 7 minutes watching commercials, right? Post Netflix, which obviously now is adding ads, but Netflix and HBO, and like that is a superior user experience. I pay you and I can get the maximum amount of time, right? And so I suspect what will happen with Farcaster, as you know, both with our client, but as more clients start to get built, is you're going to have developers that offer products that make a different set of trade-offs. And there will definitely be a market for people who are willing to trade their time for ads in order to be free. But I can promise you, if Twitter offered me a $20 a month subscription where I could not have to see a single ad, then I would do it. I would do the same thing with Google. I do it already with YouTube. And what's interesting though is when you're an advertising based business, you don't want your best customers to shift over to the paid version, because now the advertiser is saying, wait a second, so I'm only showing ads to the not as good customers. And look, it's sort of worked for Spotify, but the reality is I think Spotify is much more driven, and I don't know the specifics of their financials, but much more driven by their subscription revenue than their free advertising tier. And it's like advertising tier is actually top of funnel to get people to actually upgrade into the subscription tier. And so I think that, going back to your point, you could end up in an era where there are 5, 6 Farcaster clients that what they optimize for is, given that you might be a subscriber, how much signal to noise ratio they can optimize and save you time, right? So rather than time spent at saying, hey, rather than spending 10 minutes a day using Farcaster, we're going to shoot to have you only spend 8, and we're just going to do a better job through machine learning or whatever to show you exactly the right content and no more. And we don't want you to doom scroll. And so I think that's just like an interesting model when you actually have business model diversity as a result of permissionless innovation and it being protocol.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I can't imagine. There's the ad-based model and the subscription model, and I think all the reasons you've pointed to as to why subscription is likely superior for the consumer, at least when it comes to social networks, is that all makes sense. But there's probably a whole nother category of business models that can sort of be incorporated and invented with crypto and tying that all into everything where I can't even really imagine or speculate on what those might be. But there might be a bunch of different models that people can come on and experiment with. And like we talked about earlier, whoever creates the best models likely win. And hopefully it's not quite as power law as sort of the centralized landscape today. But I'm sure there'll be a few platforms that sort of dominate to some extent. Last question for you. You know, you talked about using, I think it was called Feedbin for your RSS reader. I know you've been sort of prolific. I think you've called yourself a an infovore and grew up, I understand, reading a lot of newspapers and then always been reading tons of books and RSS and Twitter for 15 years. If there's anyone I'd like to ask about how they craft their information diet and think about what they're consuming and what information they're intaking, I think you're the, you know, as good of a candidate as I could think about. So I'm curious, you know, beyond the RSS feed, any sort of principles you have or observations you can reflect on from the development of your information diet over time? Like you also mentioned, you know, Fred Wilson's blog and Chris Dixon's and Mark Andreessen. These are a lot of the same people that I'm interested in reading and have read their blogs as well. So I'm curious just to hear about the development of your information diet over time.
Yeah, a couple of rules. And my Twitter account has shifted a little bit because I'm spending so much more time on Farcaster that I spend a lot less time on Twitter. But for a long time, I only followed 100 people on Twitter and was pretty maniacal about trying to use it as reverse chronological feed. And if you approach it like that, if people post too much stuff that you don't like, you just unfollow them. I'm now in the place where I follow 1,000 people, and part of it's so that I can get signal into people getting invited to Farcaster. So it's an algo feed there, and I find it infuriating. It would be interesting is actually if you could tune your own algorithm in a way that you could explicitly say, don't do this, don't do that. So I'm a little bit more rules based than machine learning, but I don't know, maybe if you get to multiple clients in an ecosystem, one team could actually build a machine learning algorithm that would make me satisfied. So I tend to be more oriented towards my RSS feeds as well as newsletters, which I think Substack has really kind of taken up a ton of share in terms of my information diet. I think the honest answer is since I've been working at Farcaster, I've spent less and less time outside of just consuming information on Farcaster. That I do think that the nice thing about an RSS reader is I have a couple of folders of just high priority blogs. So like Marginal Revolution, I've been reading for a decade. Daring Fireball, the same thing. And so there's just a set of blogs that I've tuned over time that I know they don't post too many times a day, and basically everything they post is high signal. And I tend not to follow as much news because I actually think news is kind of it is pretty commodity. And I think Paul Graham made a good observation of this, is that you can actually follow the news on more of a weekly basis than a daily basis and get pretty much the same amount of information. And I think that if anything, you improve it because you get higher signal, right? Like things actually take a couple days and like you get the actual facts start to come out. I think the other thing that is, if you've just spent enough time reading stuff on the internet, like tech news for me, I can go to techmeme.com and I can kind of just flip the bits, so to speak, in that I don't even need to click through to most of the stories. I can just read the headline and weight both like what that means. Like, oh, okay, Adobe sold to Figma for 20 billion. I really don't need to get into all these details, but like I can kind of just update all the different parts of my brain of like, okay, what does that actually mean? Like, how do I think about like startups, like a startup that's deliberate for the first few years about building rather than so that's how I kind of approach my information diet rather than deeply engaging with every piece. And I really try to save the decision power that is required to actually think, to like really dig in on an essay, is I try to put a couple of those for the weekend. And I've never been a really good user of something like Instapaper or Pocket, but I just email myself a couple of those things and I just leave them in my inbox, which is my to-do list. And then on a weekend, in a quiet moment, I just try to actually spend some time to read through an essay or two. But I think that the nice thing about building something like Farcaster is a lot of people share interesting stuff on Farcaster. And one of the reasons I really like screenshot essays is it's not as long as a well thought out essay or even a book, but the promise that you get with a screenshot essay compared to something like a Twitter thread is I know that if I click this thing open, the approximate amount of time for me to read a screenshot, like a single screenshot of text, is defined. And I think that there's also a benefit to having that constraint in terms of making your point, which is longer than a small in-feed text unit, but shorter than a normal blog post. And so I'm selfishly hoping more people try to post things that are again longer than a tweet length, but as long as something on Substack, just so that I can consume more interesting points of view without spending necessarily the time.
Yeah, those are lots of great strategies. I sort of, like I mentioned, I pegged you as a good person to ask about this, but that even exceeded any response that I could have expected about sort of some principles and just ways to systematize how you interpret data and collect information and, all of that. So really interesting. And Dan, again, want to thank you for coming on. We'll wrap up here because we've gone sufficiently over talking about the sufficiently decentralized social network. But where can people go to, how do you want to instruct them to get involved or follow along? Should they, DM you on Twitter still, or how can people follow, the future of Farcaster? And then also, if you're comfortable, I don't know, I think it'll be, this podcast won't go out for another week or so. So you'll have shipped what I understand is a pretty good feature. So if you want to talk about that in closing as well, that'd be great.
Yeah. So if anyone wants to get access to Farcaster, DM me on Twitter. I'm DWR, and just say that you heard the pod, and that will be a good sign that you're not a bot. I think the feature that we're releasing on Wednesday, assuming everything lands, is DM. So we're not actually calling direct messages, we're calling them direct casts, because everything on Farcaster should just be a cast, and you're either doing a broadcast, which is public, or a direct cast, which is private. But hoping to have that in place in the next 2 days.